Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to ancient Rome. That sprawling, marble-clad empire where togas were mandatory, lead pipes were a lifestyle choice, and the Senate spent half its time arguing about whether someone's chicken entrails predicted good weather. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a second pillow, because for the next hour and a half or so we're going to meander through some of the strangest, most oddly specific rules that governed Roman life, and discover that most of them existed because Romans kept doing incredibly stupid things until someone finally said, okay, we need a law about this. Now, when we think of ancient Rome, we usually picture gladiators, aqueducts, Julius Caesar getting extremely stabbed, that sort of thing. But the real heart of Roman civilization wasn't military conquest or architectural innovation. It was bureaucracy, glorious, obsessive, weirdly specific bureaucracy. The Romans loved rules the way modern people love arguing on the internet. They had regulations for everything, and I do mean everything. Let's start with one of my personal favorites, the sumptuary laws. These were rules about what you could wear, what you could eat, and how much you were allowed to enjoy yourself at dinner parties. Because apparently, Romans kept throwing such aggressively lavish banquets that the government had to step in and say, okay, no, you cannot serve that many roasted peacocks at one meal. We're capping it at 3 peacocks, maximum. The first major sumptuary law was the Lex Aba, passed in 215 BC. This delightful piece of legislation said that women could not own more than half an ounce of gold, could not wear multicolored dresses, and could not ride in a carriage within 1 mile of Rome unless they were attending a religious ceremony. Now, you might be thinking that seems remarkably petty and controlling, and you'd be right. But here's the thing. Rome was currently being demolished by Hannibal and his war elephants. The Second Punic War was going very badly, so the Senate looked around and thought, you know what would help? If we stopped women from wearing pretty dresses, that'll fix the Carthaginian problem. Naturally, Roman women were thrilled about this, by which I mean they staged one of the first recorded women's protests in Western history. They gathered in the streets, blocked the forum, and essentially said, absolutely not. We're keeping our gold jewelry, thank you very much. And shockingly, after several days of this, the law was repealed. Score 1 for the ladies of Rome, who apparently had more backbone than the Senate. But the sumptuary laws didn't stop there. Oh no, Romans kept passing them for centuries because Romans kept being obnoxiously wealthy and showing off about it. There were laws limiting how much you could spend on a funeral, laws about how many guests you could invite to dinner, laws about whether you could serve certain types of imported delicacies. The Emperor Tiberius once banned the sale of pastries because he thought Romans were getting too soft and hedonistic. Tiberius, for context, was a man who eventually retired to the island of Capri to live out his golden years, doing things so depraved that ancient historians could barely bring themselves to write about them. But sure, Tiberius banned the cupcakes. That's the real moral issue here. Then there was the Lex Fania of 161 BC, which got incredibly specific about dinner parties. You could only spend a certain amount per meal. You could only serve 1 hen per dinner, and it had to be unfattened. No force-feeding your chickens to make them extra delicious. Thank you very much. The law even specified which days you could throw expensive parties. Most days you had to keep it simple. But on market days, the calends, the ides and the nones, basically the important dates of the Roman calendar, you could go slightly more elaborate. Still, not too elaborate, mind you. The government was watching. Now, let's drift over to some rules about marriage, because Romans had opinions about matrimony, strong, legally enforced opinions. For starters, there was the whole citizenship situation. Roman citizens could only marry other Roman citizens, at least if they wanted their children to be legitimate citizens. This seems straightforward until you realize that Roman citizen was a weirdly exclusive club for most of Rome's history. Even people living in Italy weren't automatically citizens until 88 BC, so you didn't have these awkward situations where a Roman man would fall in love with a perfectly nice Italian woman from the next town over, and legally their children would be nobodies, just stateless little entities. How romantic. There were also laws about who could marry whom based on social class. Senators and their descendants couldn't marry freed slaves or anyone working in the entertainment industry. So if you were a senator's son and you fell for a charming actress, tough luck. The law said no. This particular rule existed because Romans considered actors to be essentially prostitutes with better memorization skills. Not my opinion, that's just what they thought. Theatre was considered deeply shameful, which is ironic considering how much Romans loved going to the theatre. They loved it so much that they built enormous amphitheatres and attended plays constantly, but actually working in theatre. Disgraceful. Classic Roman logic. The Lex Poppaea Poppaea, passed under Augustus, took marriage regulation to dystopian new levels. This law basically said that if you were a man between 25 and 60, or a woman between 20 and 50, you had to be married. And not just married, you had to have children. Specifically, freeborn Romans needed at least 3 children. Freed slaves needed 4. If you didn't meet your child quota, you couldn't inherit property as easily. You faced social penalties. You were essentially a second-class citizen because you hadn't reproduced enough. Augustus passed this law because Roman birth rates among the upper classes were dropping. Wealthy Romans had apparently looked around at the crumbling republic, the constant civil wars, the economic instability, and collectively decided, you know what, maybe we won't bring children into this mess. Reasonable, honestly. But Augustus wanted more Roman babies, so he tried to legislate reproduction into existence, because nothing says healthy family environment like government-mandated childbearing. The law also imposed penalties on unmarried people and childless couples. They couldn't attend certain public festivals. They had to sit in worse seats at the theatre. They faced inheritance restrictions. Basically, Rome decided to socially shame anyone who wasn't enthusiastically procreating. This went about as well as you'd expect, which is to say it mostly just annoyed people and created a bunch of sham marriages where people would marry in name only to avoid the penalties, then go back to living their separate lives. Romans were excellent at finding loopholes. Now, speaking of Augustus, let's talk about the adultery laws he passed. Because prior to Augustus, adultery wasn't really illegal in Rome. Frowned upon, sure. Socially awkward, definitely, but not actually criminal. If a husband caught his wife cheating, he could divorce her and keep her dowry, but that was about it. The whole thing was considered a private family matter. Augustus changed all that with the Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendus in 18 BC. This law made adultery a criminal offense. If a woman committed adultery, her husband was legally required to divorce her. Then her father, if he was still alive, could literally kill her and her lover if he caught them in the act. If the father didn't kill them, the husband could kill the lover, but not his wife. She'd be exiled instead and lose half her dowry and a third of her property. This law was deeply ironic coming from Augustus, whose own daughter Julia was famously promiscuous. In fact, Augustus eventually exiled his own daughter under this very law after her affairs became too public to ignore. Julia was reportedly sleeping with half of Rome, possibly as a form of rebellion against her controlling father. Augustus banished her to a tiny island where she wasn't allowed wine or male visitors. She died there years later, miserable and isolated. Father of the Year. That Augustus, the adultery law, also only applied to married women and the men who slept with them. Married men could sleep with unmarried women, slaves, or prostitutes without legal consequence. Because of course they could. The law wasn't really about morality. It was about controlling women's sexuality and ensuring legitimate heirs. Classic patriarchy, ancient Rome edition. Let's drift now to some rules about names, because Romans had a bizarre naming system that required actual legislation to sort out. Roman men typically had 3 names, a praenomen, a nomen, and a cognomen. The praenomen was your personal name, the nomen was your family name, and the cognomen was basically a nickname that became hereditary. So you'd have someone like Marcus Tullius, Cicero. Marcus is his first name, Tullius is his clan name, and Cicero means chickpea. His ancestor apparently had a distinctive wart that looked like a chickpea, and the family just kept the name, forever. Nothing says dignity like being named after a legume-shaped facial growth. Women had it even worse. Roman women usually only had one name, the feminine form of their father's nomen. So if your father was Julius, you were Julia. If your father was Cornelius, you were Cornelia. That's it. If your father had multiple daughters, you were all named the same thing. They'd just number you. Julia Major, Julia Minor, Julia the Elder, Julia the Younger. In large families, they'd use numbers. Julia Tertia, Julia Quarta, third Julia, fourth Julia. This created obvious problems. Imagine trying to write someone's will when all 5 daughters are named Claudia. Which Claudia gets the vineyard? Claudia the third. Obviously, she was father's favorite. But wait, is that Claudia Tertia, or the third Claudia we mentioned? You see the issue. Eventually, some women started adopting cognomini additional nicknames to distinguish themselves. But this wasn't standard practice. For most of Roman history, women just shared names, and everyone had to figure it out from context. Efficient? No, but it did make it very easy to remember women's names at dinner parties. There were only like 12 options. The naming system got even more complicated with freed slaves. When you freed a slave in Rome, they took your prenomen and nomen as their new name. So if Marcus Tullius Cicero freed a slave, that person might become Marcus Tullius Freedman of Marcus. This meant you could theoretically have dozens of people running around Rome with identical names because they'd all been freed by the same patron. The Romans dealt with this by just accepting the confusion. Sometimes you'd have to specify Marcus Tullius, the one who runs the bakery, not Marcus Tullius, the one with the missing ear. Speaking of slaves, let's talk about manumission laws, because Romans had very specific rules about freeing slaves, and those rules changed frequently depending on which emperor was panicking about something. In the early Republic, freeing slaves was fairly straightforward. You could do it informally by just treating them as free, or you could do it formally through legal procedures. Freed slaves became citizens, sort of. They couldn't hold political office, but their children could. This seems almost progressive until you remember that slavery itself is not progressive, and none of this should have been happening in the first place. But then, during the late Republic, wealthy Romans started freeing slaves in huge numbers in their wills. This was partly generous and partly strategic. Freed slaves remained loyal to their former masters and their families. They'd vote how they were told. They'd provide economic support. They'd form a dependent client base. So rich Romans would own hundreds of slaves, then free them all upon death, creating an instant political faction. Augustus looked at this and said absolutely not. This is getting out of hand. So he passed the Lex Fufia Canenia in 02 BC, which limited how many slaves you could free in your will based on how many you owned. If you owned between 3 and 10 slaves, you could free half. If you owned between 10 and 30, you could free a third. The more slaves you had, the smaller the percentage you could free. If you owned more than 100 slaves, you could free a maximum of a fifth, and never more than 100 total, regardless of how many you owned. This law existed purely to prevent the sudden mass creation of new citizens who might destabilize the political order. It wasn't about fairness or morality. It was about control. Romans were very good at that. Augustus also passed the Lex Alia Sentia in 04 AD, which made manumission even more restrictive. You couldn't free a slave if you were under 20 years old, unless you had a good reason and got special permission. The slave had to be over 30 years old to be freed, with some exceptions. And if a slave had been punished for certain crimes, like being branded or wearing chains, they could be freed. But they wouldn't become citizens. They'd become dedici, a special underclass of freed people with almost no rights. They couldn't live within 100 miles of Rome. They couldn't become citizens, ever. Even their children faced restrictions. This law existed because Romans were worried about bad slaves being freed and causing trouble. Better to keep them in legal limbo forever, just in case. Now let's drift over to the Vestal Virgins, because no discussion of weird Roman rules would be complete without talking about these women and the absolutely bizarre regulations surrounding them. The Vestal Virgins were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. There were 6 of them at any given time, and their job was to maintain the sacred fire in Vesta's temple. This fire represented Rome's eternal existence, so if it went out, that was bad, very bad, omenuvdom bad. The Vestals had to keep it burning at all costs. Girls were chosen to become Vestals between the ages of 6 and 10. They served for 30 years. During that time, they had to remain virgins, not celibate virgins. The distinction mattered to Romans. If a Vestal had sex, even once, even consensually, the penalty was death. Specifically, she'd be buried alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, then sealed in. The man involved would be publicly flogged to death. Rome did not mess around with Vestal virginity. The reason for this was religious. Romans believed that the Vestal's purity maintained the gods' favor and protected Rome. If a Vestal broke her vow, the gods would be angry, and Rome would suffer. Military defeats, plagues, famines, all potentially caused by one Vestal's sex life. No pressure, but here's where it gets weird. Vestals had extraordinary legal rights that no other Roman women possessed. They could own property independently. They could make a will. They could free slaves. They didn't need a male guardian, which was otherwise mandatory for Roman women. If they encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, they could pardon him on the spot. They had front-row seats at the games. They could ride in a carriage inside Rome, which was normally forbidden. Essentially, Vestals were among the most powerful women in Rome, as long as they never had sex, never married, and spent 3 decades tending a fire. After 30 years, Vestals could retire and marry if they wanted. Very few did, partly because they were now in their 40s or 50s, and Roman men preferred teenage brides, and partly because marrying an ex-Vestal was considered unlucky. There was a superstition that such marriages ended badly, so Vestals would give up their entire youth to serve Rome, then retire into comfortable but lonely independence. The Vestals also had to perform various rituals throughout the year, including making molla salsa, sacred salted flour used in sacrifices. They'd grind the grain by hand, mix it with salt, and prepare it according to specific rules. This was considered so important that the recipe was a state secret. Molla salzan ritual flahu. Romans took it very seriously. If a Vestal let the sacred fire go out through negligence, she'd be whipped by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. Just whipped, not killed. But if she had sex, buried alive, the proportionality of Roman punishment was always a bit questionable. There were periodic scandals involving Vestals accused of breaking their vows. Often these accusations were politically motivated. If Rome was suffering military defeats or natural disasters, someone would conveniently remember seeing a Vestal acting suspicious. Several Vestals were executed over the centuries, usually during times of crisis when Romans needed a scapegoat. The most famous case happened in 114 BC, when 3 Vestals were accused of unchastity at the same time. 3 all at once. Suspiciously convenient timing, given that Rome was dealing with military problems. 2 were executed. The 3rd was acquitted, possibly because even Romans realized this was getting ridiculous. The Vestal virgins continued serving until 394 AD, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius disbanded them as part of his campaign against pagan religions. After nearly 1,000 years of service, the order ended. The sacred fire went out. Rome kept existing anyway, which somewhat undermined the entire theological justification for burying women alive. Now let's talk about the 12 Tables, which were Rome's first written legal code. Created around 450 BC. Before this, Roman law was passed down orally by priests and patricians, which meant they could basically make it up as they went along. The plebeians, common citizens, got tired of this and demanded written laws that everyone could see. After a lot of political struggle, Rome created a commission that traveled to Greece, studied other legal systems, and came back to write down Rome's laws on 12 bronze tablets. These tablets covered everything from property rights to personal injury to religious law. They were posted in the forum so everyone could read them, which was great, except for the fact that most Romans were illiterate. But it's the thought that counts. Some of the laws were reasonable. If someone breaks another person's limb and doesn't settle the matter, there shall be retaliation in kind. Eye for an eye, basically. Standard ancient justice. Others were oddly specific. No person shall hold meetings by night in the city. This existed because Romans kept forming secret political clubs that would meet after dark and plot conspiracies. So the government said no more nighttime gatherings. If you want to overthrow the republic, you have to do it during business hours. There was a law about trees. If your neighbor's tree extended over your property line, you could legally trim the branches, but only up to 15 feet high. Above 15 feet, apparently, the tree could do whatever it wanted. The reasoning here is unclear. Perhaps Romans believed that branches above 15 feet belonged to the gods. One law said that if someone sang a song defaming another person, the penalty was death. Death for a mean song. Romans took their reputation very seriously. You could stab a man in a bar fight and maybe get away with a fine, but write a catchy, insulting jingle about him. Execution. There was also a law about funerals. You couldn't bury or burn a corpse inside the city walls, which makes sense from a public health perspective. But Romans kept doing it anyway, because they wanted fancy roadside tombs where everyone could see how wealthy they were. So the law got more specific. You couldn't bury people in the city. You couldn't have excessive mourning. Women couldn't tear their cheeks or have professional mourners wail too loudly. Funerals were getting too dramatic, apparently. Romans needed to tone it down. The 12 tables also addressed debt, which was a huge problem in early Rome. If you owed someone money and couldn't pay, they could literally enslave you. You'd become their debt slave until you worked off what you owed. If multiple creditors were involved, there was a law saying they could divide your body among them. Actual dismemberment. You get his left leg, I get his right arm. This probably didn't happen often. It's more likely the law was meant to encourage debt settlement rather than actual butchery. But the fact that it was written down is disturbing. Eventually, the debt slavery law was repealed because it was causing too many problems. Poor Romans kept falling into debt, getting enslaved, and then Rome didn't have enough free citizens to fight wars. Can't maintain an empire if you've enslaved half your army. So they changed the system. Slightly more humane, mostly pragmatic. Let's drift now to the concept of paterfamilias, which was the legal authority of the eldest male in a Roman family. This wasn't just about being the head of household. The paterfamilias had absolute legal power over everyone in his familia, his wife, children, grandchildren, slaves, and even adult sons. He could sell them into slavery. He could execute them. He could disown them. Roman law granted fathers an astonishing level of control. There was a specific term for this power, patria potestas. It meant that Roman men, no matter how old they got, were still legally under their father's authority until he died. You could be a 50-year-old senator commanding legions, but if your father was still alive, he technically owned you. He owned your property. He owned your children. Everything belonged to the paterfamilias. This created some awkward situations. Imagine being a successful general returning from Gaul with wagons full of plunder, only to have your 80-year-old father legally claim all your treasure. Thanks for the gold, son. I'll be taking that. Fathers could reject newborns if they didn't want to raise them. When a baby was born, it would be placed at the father's feet. If he picked it up, the child was accepted into the family. If he walked away, the baby would be exposed, left outside to die, or be picked up by strangers. This happened frequently with daughters, since girls were considered less valuable. They couldn't continue the family name, couldn't fight in wars, required dowries when they married. Some families would keep one daughter, expose the rest. Efficient, sure, horrifying. Also yes, the exposure of infants was technically illegal during the empire, but it still happened. Unwanted babies would be left at the columna lactaria, the milk columnier, the vegetable market. Childless couples or slave dealers would sometimes take them. Girls might be raised as prostitutes. Boys might become slaves or gladiators. This was just accepted as normal. Rome was not a sentimental place. The paterfamilias could also emancipate his children legally, release them from his authority. But this required a strange ritual. The father would symbolically sell his son 3 times. After the 3rd sale, the son would be free. Why 3 times? Because Roman law said that if you sold something twice, you still had a claim on it, but 3 times, that was permanent. So fathers would go through this whole performance of fake sales to legally liberate their adult sons. Very efficient legal system, Rome. Now let's talk about the toga, because Romans had rules about this garment that bordered on obsessive. The toga was the formal dress of Roman citizens. Only citizens could wear it. Slaves, foreigners, and exiled Romans were forbidden from wearing togas. So your outfit was literally a statement of citizenship. If you were caught wearing a toga and you weren't a citizen, that was illegal. If you were a citizen and you weren't wearing your toga at formal occasions, that was considered disgraceful. Togas were massive semicircular wool garments, about 20 feet long, that draped over the body in a specific way. They were hot, heavy, uncomfortable, and required careful arrangement to look right. Romans complained constantly about wearing them. Martial, the poet, called the toga the oppressive burden of peace. Even in ancient Rome, formal wear was miserable. There were different types of togas for different occasions and social ranks. The toga virilis was the plain white toga of adult male citizens. Boys wore a toga with a purple border until they came of age, usually around 14 to 16. Then they have a ceremony where they dedicate their childhood toga to the household gods and don their adult toga. This was a big deal. You were officially a man now. Congratulations. Enjoy your wool rectangle. Senators wore a toga with a broad purple stripe. Curule magistrates, higher-ranking officials, wore a toga praetexta with a purple border. Generals celebrating a triumph wore a solid purple toga embroidered with gold. This was called a toga picta, and you could only wear it during your triumph procession. After that, back to regular togas. No, wearing your purple and gold in everyday life. That would be showing off. There was also the toga pulla, a dark grey or black toga worn for mourning, and the toga candida, a bright white toga worn by political candidates. The word candidate comes from this candidatus, meaning wearing white. Politicians would whiten their togas with chalk to make them extra bright and noticeable when campaigning. Roman elections were apparently very dusty affairs. Women originally wore togas, but by the late Republic, respectable women wore the stola instead, a long dress. The only women who wore togas were prostitutes. This was a deliberate mark of shame. If a woman was convicted of adultery, she'd be required to wear a toga in public. So the garment that symbolized citizenship for men symbolized sexual disgrace for women. Rome was nothing if not consistent in its double standards. The rules about togas became so burdensome that by the imperial period, many Romans just stopped wearing them except when absolutely necessary. They'd wear tunics instead, simpler, cooler, more comfortable. Emperors periodically tried to enforce toga wearing at theaters and public events, but people kept forgetting their togas at home. Eventually, the toga faded from everyday use, surviving mainly in art and official ceremonies. Even Romans got tired of Rome's dress code. Let's drift over to Roman religious law, which was vast, complicated, and governed by an entire class of priests whose job was to make sure nobody accidentally angered the gods by performing a ritual incorrectly. Romans were extremely superstitious. They believed that if you performed a religious ceremony wrong, said the wrong word, made the wrong gesture, sneezed at the wrong moment, you'd have to start over from the beginning. This was called vitium, a ritual flaw, and ritual flaws could invalidate everything. There's a famous story about a Roman official who was conducting a ceremony and accidentally said the wrong word. He had to start the entire multi-day ceremony over from the beginning. Days of elaborate rituals, burned offerings, prayers, all wasted because of one mispronounced word. The gods were very particular, apparently. Romans had priests called augurs whose job was to interpret the will of the gods by watching birds. Seriously, they'd observe how birds flew, what direction they came from, what kind of birds they were, whether they made noise. Then they'd declare whether the gods approved of whatever action Rome was considering. Attacking Carthage, let's check the birds. The birds say yes, great, launched the fleet. The Augurs had enormous political power because they could essentially veto anything by declaring the omens unfavorable. This led to political abuse, naturally. If an augur didn't want something to happen, he'd just say that birds looked bad. Sorry, Jupiter's not on board with your legislation. The sparrows were facing the wrong way. There were rules about what counted as a valid omen. The augur had to be standing in a specific sacred space called a temple, which wasn't necessarily a building, just a ritually defined area. He had to be facing south. He had to observe birds in a specific section of sky. If birds flew through the wrong part of the sky, they didn't count. Rome had very technical birdwatching requirements. There were also chicken-related omens. Before battles, Romans would consult the sacred chickens. A priest would scatter grain, and if the chickens ate eagerly, that was a good sign. If they refused to eat, that was bad. Military decisions were based on chicken appetite. During the First Punic War, a Roman admiral named Publius Claudius Pulcher was about to engage the Carthaginian fleet. He consulted the sacred chickens. They refused to eat. Bad omen. His officers suggested postponing the battle. Claudius, who apparently had no respect for chickens, responded, "If they won't eat, let them drink," and threw the chickens into the sea. Then he attacked anyway. He lost. Badly. Rome lost 93 ships. Claudius was recalled, put on trial for impiety, and fined. The chickens, posthumously, were vindicated. Romans also practiced a form of divination called ecstasy, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. Priests would sacrifice a sheep or ox, cut it open, and inspect the liver, intestines, and other organs. The shape, color, and condition of the organs would reveal the god's will. A healthy-looking liver, good news. A diseased liver, the gods are displeased. A liver with an extra lobe, that's unusual. Better consult the books to see what that means. There were extensive manuals about how to read entrails, what different liver configurations meant, how to interpret unusual growths or discolorations. Rome had a whole science of organ interpretation. Modern medical students would be horrified. Let's talk about the pontiffs, Rome's most important priests. The pontiffs maintained the calendar, regulated religious law, and kept the sacred records. The head of the pontiffs was the Pontifex Maximus, the most powerful religious position in Rome. During the Republic, this was an elected position. Julius Caesar was Pontifex Maximus. So was Augustus. Eventually, Roman emperors just automatically held the title. The Pope still uses the title Pontifex Maximus today, though with significantly different job duties. The pontiffs had the authority to determine when religious festivals would occur, which gave them substantial political power. Rome's calendar was a mess for most of the Republic. It was lunar-based, but kept falling out of sync with the seasons. The pontiffs were supposed to add intercalary months, extra months, inserted periodically to realign the calendar, but sometimes they'd add months for political reasons, extending the terms of friendly magistrates or shortening the terms of opponents. This led to situations where the calendar said it was spring, but it was clearly winter. Harvests didn't align with festival dates. Military campaigns got confused. Finally, Julius Caesar reformed the whole thing in 46 BC, creating the Julian calendar, which is basically the calendar we still use. He added 90 extra days that year to get everything realigned. 46 BC was 445 days long. The year of confusion, they called it, but afterward, the calendar worked properly. Score 1 for Caesar. Romans also had the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies that were consulted during emergencies. According to legend, a mysterious woman, the Cumaean Sibyl, offered to sell King Tarquin 9 books of prophecies. He refused, thinking the price too high. She burned 3 books, and offered the remaining 6 at the same price. He refused again. She burned 3 more, and offered the final 3 at the original price for 9. At this point, Tarquin realized she wasn't negotiating, and bought them. These 3 books were kept in the Temple of Jupiter and guarded carefully. They were written in Greek hexameter verse and contained prophecies and instructions for dealing with crises. When Rome faced disasters, plagues, famines, military defeats, priests would consult the Sibylline books for guidance. The books usually recommended introducing new gods or new religious practices. The plague will end if you build a temple to Apollo. The famine will stop if you perform the Greek rite of Ceres. This is how Rome kept absorbing foreign gods. The Sibylline books told them to. The books were destroyed in 83 BC when the Temple of Jupiter burned down. Rome sent ambassadors across the Mediterranean to collect replacement prophecies, but it was never quite the same. The new collection was eventually destroyed by a Christian general in 405 AD, ending a 1,000-year tradition of consulting cryptic Greek poetry during national emergencies. Now, let's drift over to some rules about trials and punishment. Because Roman justice was creative. For most of the Republic, Rome didn't have professional judges or prosecutors. Trials were public affairs. A citizen would accuse someone of a crime, and the case would be heard before an assembly of citizens or a jury of peers. The accused could defend himself or hire an orator to speak for him. This is how Cicero became famous. He was an absolutely brilliant defense attorney who could talk juries into almost anything. Punishments varied wildly depending on your social class. If you were a Roman citizen accused of a capital crime, you had the right to appeal to the people. This meant your case could be brought before a popular assembly, and they'd vote on your guilt. This was called provocatio, and it was a fundamental right of citizenship. If you were a non-citizen, you had no such rights. You could be tortured, executed, or enslaved at the discretion of magistrates. Justice was not blind in Rome. It was very aware of who you were and how much money you had. Crucifixion was a common punishment for slaves and non-citizens, especially for rebellion or serious crimes. It was deliberately humiliating and painful, meant to deter others. The victim would be stripped naked, nailed or tied to a cross, and left to die slowly over hours or days. Crucifixions were performed along major roads so everyone could see. After Spartacus's slave rebellion was crushed in 71 BC, Rome crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Their bodies were left hanging for months as a warning. Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. That was considered too degrading. If you were a citizen condemned to death, you'd be beheaded instead, much faster, more dignified, or you might be given the option of voluntary exile. Many wealthy Romans facing conviction would simply leave Italy before the trial concluded. Once in exile, their property would be confiscated, but they'd keep their lives. Not ideal, but better than execution. There was also a punishment called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. Criminals would be thrown into the arena with wild animals during public games, lions, bears, leopards. The animals would be starved beforehand to make them aggressive. This was considered entertainment. Romans would pack the Colosseum to watch criminals get mauled. Sometimes they'd stage elaborate mythological scenes, with the condemned criminal playing the role of a character who dies horribly. Today, Orpheus will be torn apart by wild beasts, exactly like in the myth, except more screaming. For certain crimes, especially treason or parricide, killing your father, Romans used a punishment called pona culae, penalty of the sack. The convicted person would be sewn into a leather sack, along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, then thrown into a river. The symbolism was that someone who committed such an unnatural crime should die in the company of animals. Why those specific animals? Nobody knows. Roman symbolism was often baffling even to Romans. This punishment was rare, but it was on the books for centuries. The last recorded use was in the 6th century AD, under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. 1400 years of occasionally drowning people in sacks with confused animals. Let's talk about the Lex Scantinia, a law about sexual morality that historians still argue about because the actual text doesn't survive. We only have references to it in later sources. What we think we know is that it criminalized certain continued 1928 sexual acts, specifically adult men having sex with freeborn Roman boys. This seems straightforward until you realize that Romans had very different attitudes about sexuality than modern people. In Rome, the penetrator in a sexual act maintained his dignity and status. The penetrated person was considered passive and submissive, which was shameful for a free adult man. So Roman men could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without social stigma, as long as they were the active partner. But being penetrated was considered degrading. The lex scantinia apparently targeted men who took the passive role or who sexually exploited freeborn youths, but it was rarely enforced. We have almost no records of prosecutions. It seems to have been one of those laws that existed more as a moral statement than an actual legal tool. We officially disapprove of this, but we're not going to actually do anything about it unless it becomes politically convenient. Historians argue endlessly about the details because Roman sexuality is complicated and our sources are incomplete. What's clear is that Rome had laws about sex, but those laws mostly protected the dignity of freeborn citizens rather than protecting people from abuse. Slaves had no legal recourse. They were property. Now, let's drift into the world of Roman military discipline, because the army had rules that make modern military regulations look relaxed. Roman soldiers were expected to be absolutely obedient. There is a famous story about a consul named Manlius Torquatus, whose son won a victory in single combat during a battle. This sounds great. Brave, young warrior defeats an enemy champion, except the son had engaged in combat without orders. Manlius, enforcing military discipline, had his own son executed in front of the entire army. This became known as Manlian discipline and was held up as an example of proper Roman virtue. Father kills son to maintain military order. Very Roman, very grim. There was a punishment called decimation, used when an entire unit had displayed cowardice or mutinied. The unit would be divided into groups of 10, and they'd draw lots. One man in each group would be selected and beaten to death by the other 9. 1 in 10 soldiers killed, hence decimation. This punishment was rare because it was so brutal it could cause more problems than it solved. Killing 10% of your own army tends to hurt morale, but it was used occasionally, usually when a unit had completely collapsed in battle or deserted en masse. The survivors would be so traumatized and terrified that they'd never break formation again. Effective. Arguably. Horrifying. Absolutely. Roman soldiers had to swear a military oath called the sacramentum. They pledged absolute obedience to their commander and to Rome. Breaking this oath was considered a religious violation as well as a military crime. You weren't just betraying your general, were offending the gods. Soldiers who deserted faced execution if caught. Soldiers who fell asleep on watch faced execution. Soldiers who lost their weapons faced execution. The Roman military did not do second chances. But if you served your time and survived, the rewards were substantial. After 25 years of service, you'd receive a discharge bonus land or money and Roman citizenship if you didn't already have it. Many auxiliary soldiers from the provinces joined the Roman army specifically to gain citizenship for themselves and their families. Risk death for 25 years, but your grandchildren get to be Roman. That was the deal. Roman soldiers couldn't legally marry while serving, but many had de facto wives and families. These relationships weren't officially recognized until discharge. Then the soldiers could formally marry, and their children would be legitimized and granted citizenship. The military marriage ban existed partly to keep soldiers focused, and partly to avoid having to pay benefits to families. Typical Rome. Pragmatic to the point of cruelty. Now let's talk about the grain dole. Because Rome had welfare, sort of, and it came with rules. The unknown was Rome's grain supply system. The city imported massive quantities of grain, mostly from Egypt and North Africa, to feed its huge population. At its peak, Rome had over 1 million inhabitants, and most of them couldn't grow their own food. They depended on the grain supply. Starting in the late Republic, Rome began distributing free grain to citizens. This started as a political move. Populist politicians would promise cheap or free grain to win votes. Eventually, it became institutionalized. If you were a Roman citizen living in Rome, you could register for the grain dole and receive a monthly ration of wheat. At first, it was subsidized, grain sold below market price. Then, Julius Caesar made it free. About 150,000 to 320,000 citizens were on the grain dole at various points during the empire. This was a huge expense, but it kept the urban population from rioting. Bread and circuses keep people fed and entertained, and they won't overthrow you. There were strict rules about who qualified. You had to be a male Roman citizen living in Rome. You had to register in person. You couldn't sell your grain ration, that was illegal, though people did it anyway. The ration was about 33 kilograms per month, enough to feed a person but not a family. The assumption was that heads of households would receive the grain and share it with their families. The system was ripe for abuse. People would register dead relatives and collect their rations. People would bribe officials to get on the list. There were periodic purges where the government would audit the rolls and kick off anyone who didn't qualify. Augustus supposedly reduced the number of recipients from 320,000 to 200,000 through one of these purges. The grain dole created economic distortions. Why would a poor citizen work when they could get free grain? This was a constant complaint from wealthy Romans who didn't understand that the grain ration alone wasn't enough to live on. You still needed money for housing, clothing, and anything other than bread. But the perception existed that the grain dole created laziness. It also made Rome dangerously dependent on imported grain. If the grain ships from Egypt were delayed by storms, people would panic. There were bread riots. Emperors who failed to maintain the grain supply faced serious political consequences. This gave grain-producing provinces enormous leverage. Egypt was so crucial that Augustus made it illegal for senators to even visit Egypt without imperial permission. He didn't want anyone getting ideas about controlling Rome's food supply. The grain dole lasted for centuries, evolving over time. Eventually, they started distributing bread instead of grain. Since many urban residents didn't have ovens, the state built bakeries and distributed loaves. By the late empire, they were also distributing wine, pork, and olive oil. The welfare system expanded even as the empire declined. Rome kept feeding its citizens until the very end. Now let's drift over to inheritance law, because Romans had strong opinions about who should get your stuff when you died. Roman wills were complex legal documents. You had to follow specific formulas. You had to name an heir or heirs explicitly. If you didn't, your estate would be divided according to default rules, which might not reflect your wishes. There was a rule called the Lex Falcidia, passed in 40 BC, which said that if you left bequests to multiple people, your primary heir had to receive at least 1/4 of the estate. This prevented people from writing wills where they gave everything away to friends, charities, or random strangers, leaving their official heir with nothing. This law existed because some Romans, angry at their relatives, would deliberately cut their heirs out of their wills by leaving everything to others. I'm leaving my entire fortune to my barber, my favorite prostitute, and the guy who sells fish in the forum. My ungrateful son gets nothing. The Lex Falcidia said no, your heir gets at least 25%. You can be petty, but not that petty. There were also rules about intestate succession. What happened if you died without a will? Your estate would go to your nearest male relatives following the rules of agnatic succession. Your sons first, then your brothers, then your father's brothers, and so on. Women could inherit, but they were lower in the succession order. If you had a son and a daughter, the son got everything. The daughter got a dowry when she married, but that was separate from inheritance. This system heavily favored male relatives, which was the point. Rome wanted property to stay in the patrilineal family line. Daughters would marry into other families, so giving them property meant it would leave the family. Better to keep everything with the sons. Roman women with property had to have a male guardian or tutor to approve financial decisions. This was ostensibly to protect women from making bad financial choices, but really it was about controlling women's wealth. Over time, this became more of a formality. Women would appoint cooperative male relatives who'd rubber stamp whatever they wanted to do. By the late empire, the tutelar system was largely obsolete, though still technically required. Let's talk about adoption, because Romans used adoption as a political tool in ways that would seem bizarre today. Roman men could adopt adult men as their sons. This wasn't about providing homes for orphans. This was about creating heirs, political alliances, and perpetuating family names. If you didn't have a son, you'd adopt someone orphan, an adult nephew, or a promising young politician. The adopted person would become a full member of your family, with all the legal rights of a biological child. They'd take your name, inherit your property, and continue your family line. This was completely normal and respected. Some of Rome's most famous figures were adopted. Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar. Tiberius was adopted by Augustus. The whole Julian-Claudian dynasty was an adoption chain. Adoption required a specific legal procedure. The adoptee had to be formally released from their birth family, emancipated, then formally accepted into the new family. This involved rituals and legal witnesses. You couldn't just informally adopt someone. It had to be official. Sometimes adoption was used to get around inheritance restrictions. If a woman was independently wealthy but had no male relatives, a man might arrange to adopt her, then immediately die, making her his heir. She'd inherit his name and property, then do whatever she wanted with it. This was a workaround to give women more financial independence. Romans also used a form of posthumous adoption where they'd adopt someone in their will. I'm dead now, but my estate adopts Marcus, whoever he was, as my son. This was legally binding. Marcus would inherit everything and take the deceased's name. The practice of strategic adoption continued throughout Roman history. It was how emperors created dynasties without biological sons. Nerva adopted Trajan. Trajan adopted Hadrian. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, who adopted Marcus Aurelius. The 5 good emperors were mostly an adoption chain. When Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern by making his biological son Commodus his heir, things went badly. Commodus was terrible. Maybe they should have stuck with adoption. Let's drift now into some regulations about public behavior. Because Romans had opinions about how you should conduct yourself in public spaces, there were laws against public urination and defecation, though these seem to have been enforced sporadically. Rome had public toilets, large latrines, with rows of seats where people would sit side by side, doing their business while chatting. No privacy, just communal elimination. Very efficient. The latrines used running water, usually water from the public baths that had already been used and was being flushed through the sewer system. You'd sit on a marble bench with a hole in it, positioned over a channel of flowing water. There were also sponges on sticks, the zilus pangum, which you'd use for wiping. The sponges sat in a channel of running water or vinegar between uses. You'd use the communal sponge, rinse it, and leave it for the next person. This is why rich Romans had private toilets. Nobody wanted to share a butt sponge with strangers if they could avoid it. Rome's sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was one of the city's engineering marvels. It channeled waste and stormwater out of the city, but it also created problems. Rats lived in the sewers. Gases would build up. There are stories, probably apocryphal, of people being injured by sewer gas explosions while using the toilet. There was also a superstition that demons lived in the sewers and could attack you through the toilet. Romans would sometimes offer prayers before using the latrine, just to be safe. Public defecation was considered vulgar, but sitting on a stone bench surrounded by demons while using a shared sponge, that was civilization. Romans had laws about taverns and inns, which were considered disreputable establishments. Respectable Romans didn't eat in restaurants, they ate at home. Taverns were for the lower classes, travelers, and people up to no good. There were regulations limiting where taverns could operate, what they could serve, and who could visit them. At one point, Tiberius banned taverns from selling cooked food, only allowing them to serve vegetables and pulses. This was meant to discourage people from eating out and wasting time in taverns when they should be at home being virtuous. It didn't work. Romans kept going to taverns. Eventually, the ban was repealed because it was unenforceable and making people angry. There were also rules about gambling. Gambling was technically illegal except during Saturnalia, the December festival, when normal social rules were suspended. The rest of the year, you weren't supposed to gamble, but Romans gambled constantly anyway. Dice games, board games, betting on chariot races. Gambling was hugely popular. The anti-gambling laws were rarely enforced, unless you were really obvious about it, or someone wanted to make an example of you. Mostly, people gambled discreetly and nobody cared. It was one of those laws that existed more for moral posturing than actual enforcement. Romans also had regulations about public bathing, which was a central part of Roman social life. The baths were open to everyone, though men and women bathed separately or at different times. Entry fees were minimal even poor Romans could afford the baths. There were rules about behavior in the baths. You couldn't bring weapons. You couldn't cause disturbances. Theft was a constant problem. You'd leave your clothes in the changing room, and someone might steal them while you were bathing. The baths employed attendants to watch people's belongings, but theft still happened regularly. Emperors periodically tried to ban mixed-gender bathing when it started happening in some baths. Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian both issued edicts about this. The concern was that mixed bathing led to immorality and scandalous behavior. Probably it did, but people kept doing it anyway because Romans were not easily controlled. The baths also had rules about oil and strigils, the curved metal scrapers used to remove oil and dirt from skin. You'd oil yourself, exercise, or sweat in the hot rooms, then scrape off the oil and grime. The scraped-off oil and sweat mixture was considered to have medicinal properties. People would collect it and sell it. There was a market for gladiators' sweat, which was thought to be especially potent. You could buy a vial of gladiator sweat and rub it on yourself for health benefits. Let's talk about some rules regarding freed slaves. Because their status was complicated and heavily regulated, freed slaves' liberty became citizens, but with restrictions. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't serve in the legions, only in auxiliary units. They had ongoing obligations to their former masters, their patroni. This was called the patronage system. A freed slave owed their patron obedience and service. They might have to work for their patron a certain number of days per year. They had to support their patron politically. They couldn't sue their patron in court without special permission. If a freed slave became wealthy, and some did, especially in business and trade, their patron might expect financial support. In exchange, the patron was supposed to protect and assist their freedman, provide legal help, business connections, social support. This was a reciprocal relationship, though heavily imbalanced in favor of the patron. There were laws regulating what freed slaves could and couldn't do. The Lex Alia Sensia, which we touched on earlier, restricted marriage between freed slaves and free-born citizens of high status. Freed slaves couldn't marry senators' families. This was meant to maintain social barriers and prevent wealthy freed slaves from marrying into the elite. Despite these restrictions, many freed slaves became extremely successful. Trimalchio, the fictional character in Petronius' Satyricon, is a freed slave who becomes absurdly wealthy and throws grotesque dinner parties where he shows off his fortune. He's satirical, but he's based on reality. There were real freed slaves who accumulated enormous wealth, bought their own slaves, and became significant figures in Roman society. This created tension. Freeborn Romans, especially those who were poor, resented freed slaves who became wealthier than they were. How dare a former slave be richer than a freeborn citizen? Freed slaves were legally inferior, even if economically superior. This cognitive dissonance bothered people. There were periodic attempts to crack down on freed slaves displaying wealth too ostentatiously, more sumptuary laws, but they were hard to enforce. If a freed slave had money, they were going to spend it. Rome couldn't stop them without damaging the economy. Let's drift now to rules about collegia, private associations and clubs. Romans formed clubs for everything: trade guilds, religious associations, funeral societies, social clubs. These collegia provided community support, religious functions, and sometimes political influence. The government was suspicious of collegia because they could become centers of political organizing. Rival gangs in the late Republic were often organized around collegia. They'd fight in the streets, intimidate voters, and generally cause chaos. So there were periodic bans or restrictions on collegia. Julius Caesar disbanded most collegia, except for the most ancient and respectable ones. Augustus allowed some to reform, but kept strict regulations. You needed government permission to form a new collegium. You had to register. Your membership rolls had to be submitted to authorities. No secret societies. There were rules about how often collegia could meet, usually once a month. They couldn't gather in large groups without permission. These rules were meant to prevent collegia from becoming political factions or private armies. Despite regulations, collegia thrived. They were too useful. Workers needed guilds. People needed social support. The government tolerated them as long as they stayed out of politics. But if a collegium got too powerful or too politically active, it would be disbanded. Now, let's talk about the peculium property held by slaves. Legally, slaves in Rome owned nothing. Everything they had belonged to their master. But in practice, masters often allowed slaves to manage property and earn money. This was the peculium. A slave might run a business, keep accounts, accumulate savings. Legally, it all belonged to the master, but by custom, it was treated as the slaves. The peculium served everyone's interests. Masters profited from their slaves' work without having to manage everything directly. Slaves had incentive to work hard because they might save enough to buy their freedom. It was exploitation, but with a carrot. There were rules about peculium. If a slave used their peculium to conduct business and ran up debts, the master was legally liable, but only up to the value of the peculium. This protected masters from being bankrupted by their slaves' bad business decisions. Yes, my slave owes you money, but I am only responsible for what I gave him, not whatever scheme he got into on his own. Some slaves accumulated substantial peculia, enough to buy their own freedom and have money left over to start a business. Some even bought their own slaves using their peculium, though legally those slaves belonged to the master, not the slave. Roman slavery was legally straightforward, but practically convoluted. Let's talk about the role of the censor, a peculiar Roman magistrate whose job was to conduct the census and regulate public morals. Every 5 years, Rome held a census. 2 censors would be elected to count citizens, assess their property, and assign them to voting tribes and classes. This was crucial for taxation and military recruitment. But censors also had the power to remove people from the Senate or from higher social classes if they deemed them morally unfit. This was called the nota censoria, the censor's mark of disapproval. If a censor decided you'd done something disgraceful, they could downgrade your social status. They could remove you from the Senate. They could take away your horse if you were an equestrian. They could move you to a lower voting class. What counted as disgraceful? Pretty much anything the censor decided. Not maintaining your property, divorcing your wife without good reason, being too ostentatious, being too stingy, beating your slaves too harshly, not beating your slaves enough. Censors had enormous discretion. This power was rarely used because censors faced political consequences if they were too harsh. If you humiliated powerful people, they'd retaliate later. So censors mostly used the nota censoria against people who were already unpopular or who'd done something genuinely outrageous. There's a story about a senator who was removed from the Senate because he kissed his wife in public in front of their daughter. The censor deemed this inappropriately affectionate for a Roman man. Whether this story is true is debatable, but it reflects Roman attitudes. Public displays of affection were considered undignified. The censorship declined in importance during the empire as emperors consolidated power. Eventually, emperors just held the censor's powers themselves and revised the Senate's membership as they pleased. No need for elections. Let's finish with one of the most Roman institutions, patronage and the morning salutatio. Wealthy Romans had clientspora citizens who depended on them for support. In exchange, clients provided political support, deference, and assistance when needed. This was the patron-client relationship, and it was fundamental to Roman society. Every morning, clients would visit their patron's house for the salutatio, the morning greeting. They'd line up, wait their turn, and greet their patron. In return, they might receive a small gift of money or food, the sportula. Then they'd accompany their patron to the forum, providing a visible entourage that demonstrated his importance. There were rules about the salutatio. Clients had to show up regularly or risk losing their patron's favor. They had to dress appropriately, the toga. Naturally, they had to show proper deference. The patron, in turn, was expected to provide genuine support, legal help, business connections, loans, recommendations. This system meant that wealthy Romans spent their mornings receiving lines of clients, afternoons conducting business, and evenings at dinner parties. It was exhausting, but it was how Roman society functioned. Status and power were maintained through networks of obligation. Clients who became wealthy would become patrons themselves, attracting their own clients. The system was hierarchical, but somewhat fluid. Everyone except the poorest had someone above them and someone below them. You'd be both patron and client, depending on the relationship. The salutatio gradually declined during the empire as imperial bureaucracy replaced personal patronage networks, but it never entirely disappeared. Even in late antiquity, powerful men maintained their morning receptions. The practice eventually influenced medieval and early modern court culture. The levee, the morning reception of a king or nobleman, descends directly from the Roman salutatio, and that, after an hour and a half of wandering through ancient Roman regulations, brings us to the end of our journey through Rome's bureaucratic maze. We've seen laws about togas and toilets, regulations about chickens and citizenship, rules governing everything from how many peacocks you could serve at dinner to how many times you had to symbolically sell your son to set him free. The Romans built an empire that lasted 1,000 years in the west and another 1,000 in the east. They gave us roads and aqueducts, literature and law, but mostly they gave us rules. So many rules. Rules about everything. Because Romans, despite their reputation for military discipline and stoic virtue, were actually chaotic, hedonistic, superstitious people who needed an enormous legal framework just to prevent them from gambling away their estates, freeing too many slaves, throwing excessive funeral parties, and generally making a mess of civilization. Every weird rule existed because someone, somewhere, did something so spectacularly stupid or problematic that the Senate said, okay, we need a law about this now. And isn't that, ultimately, the most human thing about Rome? Not the conquests or the architecture or the philosophy, but the fact that they needed laws to stop people from wearing the wrong clothes, serving too much food at parties, and throwing sacred chickens into the ocean. Sleep well, everyone, and be grateful you don't have to wear a toga. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Netherlands in the 1850s to follow the strange, tragic, and deeply uncomfortable life of a man who cut off part of his own ear, sold exactly one painting during his lifetime, and is now worth more dead than almost any artist in history. So go ahead and settle in, maybe adjust that pillow, dim the lights a little more, because for the next while, we're going to meander through the life of Vincent van Gogh, a man who wanted desperately to be loved, failed at almost everything he tried, and accidentally became one of the most famous artists who ever lived, entirely after he was dead and couldn't enjoy any of it. Vincent van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in a small Dutch village called Grootsundert, which sounds exactly like the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happens. His father, Theodorus van Gogh, was a Protestant minister, stern, proper, deeply religious, the kind of man who believed suffering built character. His mother, Anna Cornelia Carbentus, came from a family of bookbinders and was apparently somewhat cold and distant. So right away, Vincent's childhood had that classic recipe for future mental health issues: religious severity mixed with emotional unavailability. Here's something that definitely didn't help. Exactly 1 year before Vincent was born, his mother had given birth to another son, also named Vincent van Gogh. That baby was stillborn. They buried him in the local churchyard. Then, a year later to the day, they had another son and named him the exact same name. So Vincent grew up walking past a gravestone with his own name on it. His parents had literally replaced their dead child with him, gave him the same name, and expected him to just be fine with that. Psychologists would have a field day with this. Vincent grew up knowing he was a replacement, a substitute for the perfect dead baby who never disappointed anyone. This seems to have contributed to his lifelong feeling of being inadequate, unwanted, and fundamentally wrong somehow. Great start, Vincent, really setting you up for success here. Vincent had 5 siblings who survived infancy. His younger brother, Theo, born in 1857, would become the most important person in his life. The 2 brothers were incredibly close. Theo supported Vincent emotionally and financially for most of his adult life. Without Theo, Vincent would have starved or frozen to death in a ditch somewhere. Remember Theo, he's the only reason we know Vincent's name. Vincent's childhood was unremarkable. He was a quiet, serious child, not particularly popular. He liked drawing, but lots of children liked drawing. He went to boarding school for a while, hated it, came home. At 15 he dropped out of school entirely. His family needed him to start earning money, so they found him a job. The Van Gogh family had art world connections. Vincent's uncle also named Vincent, because this family recycled names like they were running out, was a partner in an art dealing firm called Goupil & C. Uncle Vincent got young Vincent a job at the firm's branch in The Hague. So at 16, Vincent van Gogh started working as an art dealer, and he was actually good at it. For a while, he was knowledgeable about art, could talk to clients, made sales. The firm transferred him to London in 1873, which seemed like a promotion. Vincent was 20 years old, living in London, working in the art world. Things were looking up. Then Vincent fell in love with his landlady's daughter, a woman named Eugenie Lawyer. He became obsessed with her, completely, intensely obsessed. He convinced himself they were meant to be together. He barely knew her, but in his mind, they were destined. When he finally worked up the courage to propose marriage, Eugenie informed him that she was already secretly engaged to someone else. Vincent was devastated, utterly destroyed. He sank into a deep depression. His behavior became erratic. He started neglecting his work at the gallery. He'd argue with customers about art instead of selling to them. He became intensely religious, reading the Bible constantly, quoting scripture to anyone who'd listen. This pattern would repeat throughout Vincent's life. Intense obsession with a woman, rejection, complete emotional collapse, bizarre behavior. He never learned. He just kept doing it. Goupil & C eventually fired him in 1876. He'd become impossible to work with. So Vincent, now 23 and unemployed, decided he wanted to become a minister like his father. He would dedicate his life to God and to helping the poor. Surely this would work out better than art dealing. He moved back to England and took a job as a teaching assistant at a boarding school. The pay was terrible, basically room and board, no actual salary. Vincent didn't care. He was on a spiritual mission now. He started giving sermons at a local Methodist church. He threw himself into religious studies. But Vincent couldn't get into theology school. He failed the entrance exams. His Latin wasn't good enough. He tried again, failed again. The church didn't want him. This crushed Vincent, who believed he'd found his calling. If even God's representatives didn't think he was good enough to be a minister, what did that say about him? In 1878, Vincent decided he'd do missionary work instead. He didn't need a degree for that. He went to the Borinage, a desperately poor coal mining region in Belgium. The miners there lived in horrible conditions, poverty, disease, dangerous work. Vincent moved into a tiny shack, slept on straw, gave away his possessions to the poor. He was trying to live like Jesus, suffering alongside the people he wanted to help. The church was not impressed. They thought Vincent was going too far. He was making the other missionaries look bad by comparison. He was too extreme, too intense, too weird. After 6 months, they dismissed him. Even doing charity work, Vincent was too much. So now Vincent was 27 years old. He'd failed as an art dealer, failed as a teacher, failed as a minister, failed as a missionary. He was living in poverty in a Belgian mining town with no prospects and no clear future. His family was embarrassed by him. His father wanted him to be committed to an asylum. Vincent was, by any reasonable measure, a complete failure at life. And then he decided to become an artist, not because he thought he'd be successful, but because it was the only thing left. He'd failed at everything else. Maybe he could draw. He'd always liked drawing as a child. His brother Theo was now working at Goupil & C, doing well, making money, being successful in all the ways Vincent wasn't. Vincent wrote to Theo asking for financial support so he could study art. Theo, bless him, said yes. He started sending Vincent money every month. This would continue for the next 10 years, until Vincent's death. Theo supported his older brother entirely, paying for his rent, food, art supplies, everything. Vincent never paid him back, never could have. Theo just kept sending money because he loved his brother and believed in him, when literally nobody else did. Vincent started teaching himself to draw. He was 27 late to start an art career by any standard. Most successful artists started training as children or teenagers, but Vincent threw himself into it with his characteristic obsessive intensity. He drew constantly. Peasants, laborers, the poor people he'd lived among in the Borinage. His early work was dark, heavy, somewhat clumsy. He had technical skill but no formal training. Everything was self-taught through books and copying other artists' work. He briefly attended art school in Brussels but got into arguments with the instructors about technique. Vincent had strong opinions about everything. He thought academic art training was too rigid, too focused on classical forms and idealized beauty. He wanted to draw real life, real people, the ugly truth of poverty and labor. His family still thought he was wasting his time. His father remained deeply disappointed. Here was Vincent, nearly 30 years old, living off his younger brother's charity, pursuing an art career that would obviously lead nowhere. They'd all given up on him ever being normal or successful. Vincent moved back in with his parents for a while in 1881. This went about as well as you'd expect. He immediately fell in love with his recently widowed cousin, Kay Voss. She had a young son, was in mourning, and had no interest whatsoever in Vincent. When he declared his love, she said no, never, absolutely not. Very clear rejection. Vincent decided this meant he needed to try harder. He began writing her obsessive letters. He visited her family's house uninvited. When they refused to let him see her, he held his hand over a lamp flame and said he'd keep it there until they let him talk to her. They blew out the lamp. Vincent's father was mortified. This kind of behavior was exactly why nobody wanted Vincent around. Vincent moved out again, this time to The Hague. He met a pregnant prostitute named Saint-Rémy, who already had one daughter. She was an alcoholic, possibly septic, and from the kind of background Vincent's family would consider appalling. Naturally, Vincent fell in love with her. He moved her and her daughter into his studio. He wanted to save her, to give her a better life, to create the family he'd never had. His family was horrified. Theo was worried. Everyone told Vincent this was a terrible idea. Vincent ignored them all. For about 1.5 years, Vincent lived with Sean, drawing and painting while she modeled for him. She appears in several of his works from this period, tired, worn down by life, pregnant or nursing. The relationship fell apart eventually. Sean started drinking more. They thought she may have gone back to prostitution to earn money. Vincent's family kept pressuring him to leave her. Finally, in 1883, Vincent left The Hague and Sean behind. She would die by suicide years later. Vincent would carry guilt about this for the rest of his life. Another person he'd tried to save and failed. Let's drift now to Vincent's brief, disastrous attempt at living with his parents again. In 1883, he moved to Newnan, where his father had taken a new parish. Vincent set up a studio and continued painting. His relationship with his parents remained tense. His father still considered him a failure and an embarrassment. His mother remained emotionally distant. Vincent spent 2 years in Newnan, painting peasants and weavers. His work was getting better, more confident, more developed. He was finding his style, though it was still quite dark. Lots of earth tones, heavy shadows, somber subjects. He painted The Potato Eaters in 1885, which shows peasants eating their meager dinner by lamplight. It's gloomy and rough and deeply unflattering. Nobody wanted to buy it. While in Newnan, Vincent fell in love with a neighbor, Margot Beekman. She was 41, 10 years older than Vincent, and from a respectable family. She actually reciprocated his feelings, which was new for Vincent. They wanted to marry. Both families were absolutely opposed. The social difference was too great. Vincent was a failure with no prospects. Her family thought she was having a mental breakdown. The stress became too much for Margot. She attempted suicide by taking poison. Vincent found her and got her to a doctor. She survived, but the relationship was over. Her family sent her away. Once again, Vincent's attempt at love had ended in disaster. Then, in March 1885, Vincent's father suddenly died of a stroke. Vincent had a complicated reaction. He'd never gotten along with his father, had always disappointed him, had never received the approval he craved. Now he never would. His father died thinking Vincent was a failure. This ate at Vincent for the rest of his life. After his father's death, Vincent stayed in Noonan for a few more months, but the village had turned against him. There were rumors that he'd gotten a local girl pregnant. He hadn't, but the damage was done. People whispered about the weird artist who lived like a pauper and consorted with peasants. Vincent decided to leave. In November 1885, he went to Antwerp. He enrolled in art classes at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, thinking formal training might help his career. It did not. The instructors thought his work was too rough, too crude. They wanted him to draw plaster casts of classical sculptures. Vincent wanted to paint real people. He lasted about a month before he was told his work was inadequate and he should move down to the beginner class. Vincent was 32 years old. He'd been painting seriously for 5 years. An art school was telling him to go back to basics. He was humiliated. He stopped attending. During his time in Antwerp, Vincent became fascinated with Japanese prints kyo. These colorful woodblock prints were flooding into Europe at the time, and artists were obsessed with them. The flat colors, bold outlines, unusual compositions, everything about Japanese art was different from European traditions. Vincent started collecting prints and studying them. This would influence his later work significantly. He also ruined his health in Antwerp. He was smoking heavily. His pipe was constantly in his mouth. He was drinking absinthe and cheap wine. He barely ate because he spent all his money on paint and canvas. His teeth were falling out. He looked gaunt and sickly. He was probably malnourished and may have had syphilis, though historians argue about this. In February 1886, Vincent suddenly decided to move to Paris. He didn't tell Theo he was coming. He just showed up. Sent Theo a note saying, "Don't be angry. I'm at the Louvre. Come meet me." So Theo, who was living in a small apartment and working long hours as an art dealer, suddenly had his financially dependent, mentally unstable, chronically ill older brother moving in with him, unannounced. Theo, because he was apparently a saint, took Vincent in. They found a larger apartment in Montmartre and lived together for 2 years. This period was crucial for Vincent's development as an artist, but it was hell for Theo. Vincent was difficult to live with, moody, argumentative, unhygienic. He'd rant about art theory for hours. He'd get into fights with other artists. He was exhausting, but Paris exposed Vincent to the cutting edge of art. This was 1886. Impressionism had happened. Post-Impressionism was happening. Artists like Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, and Paul Signac were experimenting with color and light in revolutionary ways. The art world Vincent had known as a dealer in the 1870s had completely transformed. Vincent met many of these artists through Theo, who dealt in their work. He saw their paintings, talked with them about technique, absorbed their ideas, and his own work began to change dramatically. The dark earth tones disappeared. Suddenly, Vincent was painting with bright colors, yellows, blues, reds. His brushwork became more visible, more energetic. He was learning to paint light itself. He studied with Fernand Corman, a painter who ran an informal studio where artists could work. There, Vincent met Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec and Émile Bernard, both of whom became friends. Well, temporary friends. Vincent was hard to maintain friendships with. He was too intense, too needy, too quick to take offense. Vincent painted constantly during his Paris years. He did hundreds of work-still lifes, cityscapes, portraits. He painted himself repeatedly because he couldn't afford to hire models. We have dozens of self-portraits from this period, and they chart his increasing skill with color and brushwork. They also show a man who looks progressively more haggard and troubled. The Paris art scene was exciting, but also difficult for Vincent. He was surrounded by innovative artists, but none of them were selling much work either. Theo was trying to promote Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art, but collectors weren't buying. The art establishment thought this new colorful work was unfinished, crude, not real art. Sound familiar? Vincent was part of a movement that was being rejected, just like he was. Vincent organized exhibitions of his and his friends' work at cafes and restaurants. Nobody came. Nobody bought anything. He was getting more skilled, more original, more confident in his vision, and still, nobody wanted his paintings. The relationship between Vincent and Theo became increasingly strained. Vincent's mental health was deteriorating. He was drinking heavily. He'd have outbursts of rage, then deep depressive episodes. He talked about suicide. Theo was worried but also frustrated and exhausted. He was supporting Vincent entirely, sacrificing his own comfort and savings, and Vincent was difficult and ungrateful. By early 1888, both brothers needed distance. Vincent decided to leave Paris. He wanted to go south, where the light was brighter and life was cheaper. He'd been inspired by Japanese prints and imagined the south of France as a kind of European Japan, full of color and light and artistic possibility. In February 1888, Vincent moved to Arles, a small city in France. He was 34 years old. He'd been a serious artist for about 7 years. He'd sold nothing. He was mentally unstable, physically ill, and living off his younger brother's charity. But he was about to paint some of the most famous works in art history. Arles was perfect for Vincent, at least initially. The light was incredible. The colors were vivid yellow wheat fields, blue skies, green orchards. Vincent rented a room and immediately started painting. He worked with frantic energy, sometimes completing a painting in a single day. He painted the landscape around Arles, the people, the buildings, everything. This is when Vincent developed his mature style. Bold, energetic brushstrokes, bright, sometimes harsh colors, compositions that felt alive and moving. He painted the yellow house, the building where he was staying. He painted the drawbridge at Arles. He painted the harvest, the orchards in bloom, the wheat fields. He was prolific and increasingly confident. He wrote to Theo constantly, describing what he was painting, his theories about color, his hopes for the future. The letters from this period are manic and enthusiastic. Vincent believed he'd found his paradise. He wanted to establish an artists' colony in Arles, a community of painters working together and supporting each other. The yellow house would be their studio. Artists would come from Paris and paint in the glorious southern light. Theo was skeptical but supportive. He kept sending money. He tried to promote Vincent's work to collectors, though without success. He also worried about Vincent's health and state of mind. The letters from Arles were concerning too enthusiastic, too grandiose, signs of instability. Vincent desperately wanted another artist to join him in Arles. He needed companionship, validation, someone to share his vision. He convinced Paul Gauguin, who was broke and struggling in Brittany, to come to Arles. Theo even offered to pay Gauguin a stipend to stay with Vincent and paint. Gauguin was reluctant but needed the money. In October 1888, he arrived in Arles. This would be a disaster, but for about 2 months it was productive. Vincent and Gauguin painted together, argued about art theory, pushed each other technically. Vincent painted Gauguin's chair, empty but implying presence. He painted sunflowers obsessively vase after vase of sunflowers in thick yellow paint. He was trying to decorate the yellow house to make it beautiful for his artist colony. The sunflowers were for Gauguin's room, but the two artists were incompatible. Gauguin was arrogant and condescending. He thought Vincent was talented, but undisciplined and mentally unstable, which was accurate. Vincent was emotionally needy and erratic. He'd swing between euphoria and rage. He drank too much. He wasn't sleeping well. He was showing signs of serious mental illness. They fought constantly. About art, about money, about everything. Gauguin wanted to leave. Vincent begged him to stay. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Vincent's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He was having hallucinations. His grip on reality was slipping. On December 23, 1888, something happened. The exact details are unclear and disputed. Gauguin's account says Vincent threatened him with a razor, then ran away. Other accounts differ. What's certain is that later that night, Vincent took a razor and cut off part of his own left ear. Not the whole ear, that's a myth. Most likely, he severed the lower part of the earlobe. Still horrifying, but not as dramatic as the legend. After cutting off this piece of his ear, Vincent wrapped it in newspaper, walked to a local brothel where he was known, and handed the wrapped ear tissue to a woman there, asking her to keep this object carefully. Then he went home and went to bed. The next morning, the police found him unconscious in bed, bleeding heavily. They took him to the hospital. Gauguin immediately left Arles and never saw Vincent again. The artist colony was over before it really began. Vincent spent 2 weeks in the hospital. When he was well enough, he returned to the Yellow House. But the people of Arles were frightened of him now. The weird foreign painter had mutilated himself. A group of 30 neighbors signed a petition asking the authorities to do something about him. They called him the madman with red hair. They wanted him locked up. In February 1889, Vincent had another breakdown. He was hospitalized again, this time with hallucinations and delusions. He believed people were trying to poison him. He was confined for his own safety and the safety of others. When he recovered somewhat, he was allowed to return home, but the Yellow House was locked by police order. He could paint in his studio but had to sleep at the hospital. This was untenable. Vincent was being rejected by yet another community. Even in Arles, where he'd been so happy, people were afraid of him. He was alone, unstable, and unwelcome. His paintings weren't selling. He was never going to be financially independent. He was going to drain Theo's resources forever until one of them died. On July 6, 1890, Vincent visited Theo in Paris one last time. They had a difficult conversation. Theo was exhausted and stressed. He suggested that Vincent might need to go back to an asylum. He couldn't keep providing the same level of financial support. Something had to change. Vincent returned to Auvers, devastated. This was his worst fear, that Theo would give up on him, that he'd lose his only real supporter, that he'd end up back in an asylum or on the streets. He wrote to Theo, apologizing, saying he understood the financial difficulties, that he didn't want to be a burden, but the situation seemed hopeless. Vincent was 37 years old. He'd been painting seriously for 10 years. He'd produced approximately 900 paintings and over 1,000 drawings. He'd sold one painting. His work was innovative and powerful, but nobody wanted it. The art world had rejected him as thoroughly as everything else in his life had rejected him. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday afternoon, Vincent went out into the wheat fields around Auvers with his painting equipment. What exactly happened next is unclear and disputed. The traditional account says that Vincent shot himself in the chest with a revolver, but the details have always been strange. He supposedly shot himself in a wheat field but managed to walk back to the inn. The bullet wound was in his abdomen, below the ribs, not in his heart or head. If you're trying to commit suicide with a gun, that's an odd place to shoot yourself. The bullet didn't exit his body, it lodged against his spine. Vincent arrived back at the inn, bleeding but able to climb the stairs to his room. The innkeeper, Arthur Ravoux, found Vincent lying on his bed. child now. He needed to focus on them. But instead, he was still sending money every month to his unemployable, mentally ill older brother. The guilt was crushing Vincent. He wrote to Theo and to his mother, expressing feelings of worthlessness and failure. He felt he should be able to support himself, to contribute something, to not be a burden. But he couldn't. His paintings weren't selling. He was never going to be financially independent. He was going to drain Theo's resources forever until one of them died. On July 6, 1890, Vincent visited Theo in Paris one last time. They had a difficult conversation. Theo was exhausted and stressed. He suggested that Vincent might need to go back to an asylum. He couldn't keep providing the same level of financial support. Something had to change. Vincent returned to Auvers, devastated. This was his worst fear, that Theo would give up on him, that he'd lose his only real supporter, that he'd end up back in an asylum or on the streets. He wrote to Theo, apologizing, saying he understood the financial difficulties, that he didn't want to be a burden, but the situation seemed hopeless. Vincent was 37 years old. He'd been painting seriously for 10 years. He'd produced approximately 900 paintings and over 1,000 drawings. He'd sold one painting. His work was innovative and powerful, but nobody wanted it. The art world had rejected him as thoroughly as everything else in his life had rejected him. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday afternoon, Vincent went out into the wheat fields around Auvers with his painting equipment. What exactly happened next is unclear and disputed. The traditional account says that Vincent shot himself in the chest with a revolver, but the details have always been strange. He supposedly shot himself in a wheat field, but managed to walk back to the inn. The bullet wound was in his abdomen, below the ribs, not in his heart or head. If you're trying to commit suicide with a gun, that's an odd place to shoot yourself. The bullet didn't exit his body, it lodged against his spine. Vincent arrived back at the inn, bleeding, but able to climb the stairs to his room. And that should be the end of Vincent van Gogh's story, an obscure, failed artist who killed himself in poverty and obscurity. Except it's not, because of what happened next. Part 5, The Life of Vincent van Gogh. After death, finally famous Theo was destroyed by Vincent's death. He'd devoted his adult life to supporting his brother, financially and emotionally. He'd believed in Vincent's talent when nobody else did. He'd sacrificed his own comfort and savings, and Vincent had died anyway, believing himself a failure, never knowing his work would matter. Theo tried to continue with his life. He returned to Paris, to his wife and baby son, but he was devastated and his health was already poor. Within weeks of Vincent's death, Theo had a complete breakdown. His tuberculosis worsened. He became unable to work. His mind deteriorated rapidly. He had delusions, couldn't recognize his wife, didn't know where he was. In October 1890, just 3 months after Vincent's death, Theo was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Utah. His condition was hopeless. He died there on January 25, 1891, 6 months after his brother. He was only 33 years old. The official cause was dementia paralytica caused by syphilis. Though the grief and stress from Vincent's death certainly contributed, Theo was buried in Utrecht initially, but in 1914 his body was exhumed and reburied next to Vincent's in Auvers. The two brothers who'd been so close in life now lie side by side. Their matching headstones sit in the small cemetery, covered in ivy. Visitors leave flowers, letters, art supplies as tributes. The sad brothers, together forever. But here's where the story takes its ironic turn. Theo's wife, Johanna Bongajau, was left a widow with a baby and absolutely no money. What she did have was a cramped apartment full of Vincent's unsold paintings. Hundreds of them, stacked in closets, under beds, everywhere. Paintings that had been worthless when Vincent was alive. Jo could have thrown them out, sold them cheap, just to clear space. Nobody would have blamed her. But Jo believed in Vincent's work, just as Theo had. She decided to dedicate herself to promoting Vincent's art and legacy. She organized exhibitions. She loaned paintings to galleries. She published Vincent's letters to Theo, which revealed his artistic theories, his struggles, his passionate dedication to his craft. The letters were extraordinarily articulate, insightful, deeply moving. They showed Vincent not as a crazy person who happened to paint, but as a serious artist with a sophisticated understanding of his work. Slowly, gradually, people started paying attention. Art critics began recognizing Vincent's innovation. Other artists, especially the German Expressionists, saw in Vincent a precursor, someone who'd used color and form expressively rather than representationally. The Favists claimed him as an influence. Everyone working in modernist art suddenly realized that this dead Dutchman had been doing radical things a decade earlier. By the early 1900s, Vincent was becoming famous, not commercially successful yet, but recognized as an important figure in modern art. Museums started buying his work. Collectors wanted paintings they'd ignored when he was alive. Prices began to rise. The first major retrospective of Vincent's work was held in 1905 at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, 15 years after his death. It was a revelation. Critics and artists saw the full scope of his work, the progression from dark early paintings to the brilliant, energetic works of his final years. The exhibition traveled to other cities. Vincent van Gogh was becoming a name. By the 1910s and 1920s, Vincent was internationally famous. His paintings were selling for substantial sums. Biographies were being written. He was being canonized as a tragic genius, the quintessential misunderstood artist who suffered for his art. This wasn't entirely accurate. Vincent's suffering had more to do with mental illness and social rejection than with his dedication to art, but it made a compelling narrative. The myth of Vincent van Gogh was born, the mad artist who cut off his ear, the genius who sold only one painting, the tortured soul who created beauty from pain. Some of this was true. Much of it was simplified or distorted, but the myth took hold and never let go. Jo died in 1925, having spent 35 years promoting Vincent's work. She succeeded beyond anything Vincent or Theo could have imagined. Vincent had died thinking himself a failure, but Jo turned him into a legend. By the mid-20th century, Vincent's paintings were among the most valuable in the world. Irises sold for $53.9 million in 1987. Portrait of Dr. Gachet sold for $82.5 million in 1990, the most expensive painting ever sold at auction at that time. Today, Vincent's paintings rarely come to market because museums own most of them and won't sell. When they do sell, the prices are astronomical. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, opened in 1973, houses the world's largest collection of his work, over 200 paintings and 500 drawings. It's one of the most visited museums in the Netherlands. Millions of people come every year to see the paintings nobody wanted when Vincent was alive. Vincent van Gogh has become perhaps the most famous artist in history, certainly the most famous to general audiences who might not know much about art. Everyone knows about him. The ear cutting, the sunflowers, the starry night, the tragic death. He's been the subject of countless books, films, songs, plays. His life has been dramatized endlessly. Starry Night, that painting Vincent thought was a failure, has become one of the most reproduced and recognizable images in the world. It's been parodied, referenced, printed on everything imaginable. The swirling sky Vincent painted in his Asylum studio is now a pop culture icon. There's something deeply sad about Vincent's posthumous fame. He wanted so desperately to be recognized and valued during his life. He wanted to support himself through his art. He wanted people to see his work and understand what he was trying to do. None of that happened. He died believing himself a failure who'd wasted his life and burdened his brother. If Vincent could somehow see what happened after his death, the museums, the fame, the billions of dollars his paintings are worth, would it comfort him, or would it just make the tragedy worse? He suffered so much, he worked so hard, he died in poverty and obscurity, and then, after he was gone and couldn't benefit from it or enjoy it, the world decided his work was valuable. The art world had rejected him, society had rejected him, even his own family had considered him an embarrassment. He failed at every career he attempted. He failed at relationships, friendship, love, normalcy. The only thing Vincent succeeded at was painting, and during his lifetime, that appeared to be another failure. But his paintings survived. Joe and Theo's dedication preserved them, and slowly, the world caught up to what Vincent had been doing. He'd been inventing Post-Impressionism, creating Expressionism before it had a name, using color and form in ways that would influence the entire course of modern art. He just did it too early, before anyone was ready to understand it. Vincent van Gogh painted roughly 900 paintings and over 1,000 drawings in 10 years. Most of his greatest works were created in the last 2 years of his life, when he was most mentally unstable. He worked with a feverish, desperate intensity, as if he knew he didn't have much time. And he didn't. His artistic career lasted a decade. He sold one painting. He died by suicide, probably, though some scholars now dispute even that, and suggest he might have been accidentally shot by local boys. We'll never know for certain. What we know is that he died young, poor, and convinced he'd failed at everything. And then he became immortal. The letters between Vincent and Theo are heartbreaking to read now, knowing how it ends. Vincent writes about his hopes for the future, his plans for exhibitions, his desire to eventually support himself. Theo writes back with encouragement and money. Vincent apologizes for being a burden. Theo insists it's not a burden, that he believes in Vincent's work. They both held on to hope that eventually someone would recognize Vincent's talent. They were right. They just didn't live to see it. Vincent van Gogh's life was a tragedy of mental illness, social rejection, poverty, and lost potential. But his death wasn't the end. The paintings remained. The letters remained. And because Theo and Joe believed in him, the world eventually understood what it had missed. Today, Vincent van Gogh is a household name. Children learn about him in school. His paintings hang in major museums on every continent. Tourists visit his grave in Auvers, leaving sunflowers and thank you notes. Artists cite him as an influence. Scholars write dissertations about his work. He's been dead for over 130 years, and he's more famous than ever. So sleep well, everyone. And remember that Vincent van Gogh died thinking he'd failed. But sometimes failure is just the world not being ready yet. Sometimes you're ahead of your time. Sometimes you paint masterpieces nobody wants, and then, after you're gone, they become priceless. Vincent painted his sadness, his loneliness, his fractured perception of reality. He painted wheat fields that churned with energy, skies that swirled with emotion, portraits that revealed the souls of his subjects. He painted truth as he saw it, even when it was ugly or disturbing or strange. And eventually, finally, long after it could do him any good, people looked at those paintings and said, yes, this is art, this is genius, this is important. Too late for Vincent, too late for Theo, but not too late for the rest of us. We have the paintings, we have the letters, we have the story of a man who suffered terribly, created brilliantly, and died thinking it meant nothing. It meant everything. We just weren't smart enough to know it at the time. The sadness lasted forever, just like Vincent said, but so did the beauty. And that's something. At least, that's something.